Yeah, thank you for the introduction. In my talk, I will try to give an account of some aspects of the science-public interface, focusing first on the perspective of the individual researchers, and second on the relations to the journalistic mass media. I will also try to use somewhat comparative perspectives, showing largely the patterns to be rather similar across the major knowledge-producing countries. This account is based on research I've done in the past 30 years, including surveys of scientists, of journalists, surveys of public information officers and decision makers, as well as media analysis. And in particular, I will refer to 3 surveys, a 5-country study of 1,350 biomedical researchers in 2005, including the United States, a just completed survey of 1,600 German researchers from 16 different research fields covering humanities, social sciences, hard sciences, and engineering, and an extension of that survey in the sub-sample of neuroscience to the United States. While I have the honor to present these results to you today, I should mention that they are produced by collaborations with colleagues in Germany, in the United States, and in other countries. And in particular, I would like to mention the long-lasting and ongoing collaboration with Sharon Dunwoody and Dominique Brossard from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The relationship of science and the public, or science and the media, is very often described by the metaphor of a gap. And you see here 3 different accounts of that metaphor, ranging from 1993 to almost the present time. In a way, there is a lot of truth in this metaphor. There is a kind of gap, especially if we talk about the hard sciences. The picture may be slightly different, or not only slightly different, maybe different if we talk about social sciences and humanities, which I will not do today, but rather focus on the hard sciences, just showing one picture comparing it to social sciences and humanities. So there has been a lot of research done on the nature of this gap between science on one hand and the public or the media on the other hand. For example, it has been studied the role of scientific norms in encouraging or discouraging researchers to engage with interactions with journalists. Some people thought it is a kind of reputation risk for researchers to talk to journalists, to be in the media. Then some have looked at incompatibilities of the professional cultures of scientists and journalists. And finally, there may be different perspectives or different ways of how journalism and science constructs the world. And if we remember the talk of David a few minutes ago, it's quite obvious and quite plausible that there is indeed a difference of how journalism and science looks at the world. I think the difference, or the gap between science and the public, which I see, by the way, as the distinction between inner scientific communication and public communication, which take place in separate arenas. I think the gap between the 2 arenas is functional. It is not a problem in itself, but the question is whether there is a bridge between the 2 arenas, and who enters the bridge, how many scientists enter the bridge, and who controls access to that bridge. And I will talk a little about that using some survey results. In our surveys, we asked how many contacts the researchers reported in the past 3 years, and the biomedical researchers in our 5-country studies reported, or 2/3 of them reported that they had at least once talked to a journalist in the past 3 years, and something like 30% said that they have talked 6 or more times in the past 3 years. That means roughly 2 times per year. And I mean, we can always say, well, this is too much or not much enough. But we think that it shows that contacts to the media are rather deep-rooted in the scientific community, that it's not the privilege of few visible scientists who talk to the media and in a way dominate the public picture, but that very many scientists and researchers have actually interactions with journalists. On the right side, you see a graph based on our recent study in Germany, and it shows that the frequency of contacts with journalists differs grossly between different research fields. And the research fields which are belonging to social sciences and humanities are colored red, and those belonging to hard sciences and engineering are colored blue. And as you can see, in social sciences and humanities, researchers have much more often contact to journalists than in the hard sciences and engineering. However, that does not mean that these fields are overrepresented in the coverage of the media, because the research fields are extremely different in size. So when constructing the subsamples of communication researchers and philosophers in Germany, we found few hundred, perhaps 400 researchers that could be used as sources by journalists, but we found several thousand, 10,000 of neuroscientists. So that does say nothing about the representation of these subjects in the media, but it says something about how frequent it is, how strong the orientation towards the media, how much experience researchers have with the media in the different research fields. Actually, there are sociologists in Germany, Peter Weingart, who now think that the degree of orientation of science towards the media may have problematic repercussions on scientific inquiry itself, and may be damaging the quality of the scientific processes. This is a medialization of science hypothesis, which is now being studied in a number of projects in Germany. Well, let me discuss a scientist's goals and expectations towards the media along three functions of the media, the journalistic mass media that I see. The first function, the most obvious one, is a dissemination of scientific knowledge and knowledge about science, making it widely accessible for audiences outside science. I mean, this is what we all think about when we talk about mass media and journalism and so on. And actually, this is also what scientists in our service mention first, and as the most important goal, disseminating their knowledge to a wider audience. And this is often combined with the expectation that a better informed public will also be a public that is more positive towards science. This is a deficit model that Dietram mentioned in his initial talk yesterday. The second function is that by the very active journalistic selection, these things that are selected are marked as relevant to the wider society. And that refers to scientific knowledge, research fields, projects, institutes, universities, or individual scientists. This is the basis, by the way, also for the agenda setting effect that Matthew talked about this morning. But it's a more general thing. So in our societies, in our media societies, what is in the media appears to be relevant for the whole society in one way or another. And so this is what scientists and especially scientific organizations are looking for, media visibility, because that is a message to decision makers, to the general public. What we do is relevant to society. And these two functions, dissemination, marking as relevant to society, are embraced by scientists and by scientific organizations alike. They have no problems with that, they like that, and that's the main reason why they engage in public communication activities. However, the third function of the mass media, that is transforming scientific knowledge by connecting it to phenomena, events, issues, knowledge and concerns outside science, is what is sometimes seen as problematic by researchers, because it is in their perception related to inaccuracies, to distortions. The balanced norm may lead to some false consensus or false controversy impression, and so on and so forth. If we look at the occasions when there are conflicts between scientists and journalists and irritations of scientists by journalistic reports, then it's often because of this third function that journalists transform the knowledge, the message of the scientist when putting it into the public agenda and in the public arena, that this is the reason why there are problems. And we can also diagnose from our surveys that there is a kind of controversy who should control the communication with the public. Should it be the scientist as the originator of the knowledge that is communicated, or should it be the journalist who is a professional mediator between science and journalism? And it also leads scientists to like or to look at opportunities to talk to communicate with the general public by circumventing journalism, having direct measures, as Dominic this morning talked about, perhaps the new media and the new technological possibilities have led to a revived interest in other means of communication with the public than journalism. Well, what motivates scientists to talk to journalists, to look for interactions with the media, or to accept them if they are asked? And I think there are clearly professional benefits perceived by scientists who engage in these activities. In this 5-country study, we asked the researchers who had actually reported contacts with the media whether these contacts had been mostly positive for their career or mostly negative. And as you can see, the green bars show the proportion of researchers who say it has been positive for our careers, and only the red bars show the proportion of researchers who say it has been mostly negative. So it's clear from this picture that there are much more scientists who see advantages of public visibility for the career than clear disadvantages. But there is also, of course, a group of researchers who do not perceive any impact on their career, or who see positive and negative impacts on the career. Another expectation related to media contacts is that by the media, scientists and their research is made visible to potential funders, to sponsors of the research. And this expectation is widespread in the 5 countries we studied, and it's particularly high in Germany. There is a difference to the United States, and this difference is even larger in the survey we just completed with neuroscientists. So in the United States, the expectation that media visibility increases the chance of funding is lower than in Germany, what's a little surprising for us. But we see a very strong uncertainty of American researchers about getting funding at all. So many of the American researchers did actually say don't know, so a little resignative position. So there is no means at all getting funding. At least this is one of the possible explanations. Well, what do the organizations, the universities, the research centers feel about media contacts of the members, of the researchers in them? The organizational policy in the perception of the researchers is mostly positive. That means the researchers perceive that the organizations, the management of the organizations agree or like it if they are in the media. And that is quite clear because they profit from the appearance of the researchers in the media if the name of the organization is mentioned, because visibility of the organization is an important goal and is thought to legitimize this organization or the research profile of that organization. There are only few examples of researchers who say, well, my organizational management is rather opposed to that, mostly critical. Most say 70% say it's clearly positive, and then there is a number of researchers who don't know or who say it depends. On the right side, the graph is quite interesting. It shows how free scientists feel to talk to the media, And as it turns out, they say, well, there is a need to consult before talking to a journalist, to consult with somebody in the organization. So the organization applies some kind of supervision of these individual media contacts. And we find here a very interesting pattern difference between Germany and the United States. In Germany, it's usually that, or more often, that the researchers have to ask the superiors. So the postdoc perhaps has to ask the PI, the institute director, and so on. While in the United States, it's most often the public relations department, the public information office, however the name is, whom they have to ask. This is also consistent with the results from this 5-country study, and it indicates, I think, a higher professionalization of media interactions in the United States as compared to Germany. Well, now what about the scientific community, which was thought to be critical towards contacts with journalists? And if you have a look first at the right graph, you see that the green bars are the proportion of researchers who feel that being in the media, having interactions with journalists would have a positive impact on their scientific reputation, The blue part of the bar shows the proportion of researchers who say that they feel an ambivalent response of the scientific community, of the peers, partly positive, partly negative. In both countries, only few percent perceive the scientific community as being generally opposed or critical towards media visibility of the individual researchers. So there is a kind of acceptance of media contacts by the scientific community, and we are talking here about neuroscientists, but I don't think this is confined to the group of neuroscientists. It's perhaps more general. But we also find a certain ambiguity of the scientific community. And my colleague Simone Röder from the University of Bielefeld in Germany, she had a very good idea. She thought, well, maybe it's dependent on certain conditions that have to be met when researchers talk to journalists before we can accept that. And she came up with a number of, with 3 factors, so that researchers who talk to journalists should have own research in the field about which they are talking, that they have a legitimate reason to talk to journalists that goes beyond self-marketing, and that they should wait to be asked by journalists rather than taking the initiative to talk to journalists themselves. We took these hypotheses, or these criteria, and put some other criteria together with them and tested them in our survey. And it turns out that indeed there is a perception of researchers that certain normative expectations are raised by their peers on who should communicate how to journalism. There are also some interesting differences between Germany and the United States, not very huge but small, but I will not go into these details here. If I had to summarize some trends in public science communication, I would point to the increasing weight of organizations in the regulation of scientist media contacts as compared to the influence of the scientific community. So whether and how scientists engage in media interactions is more regulated by organizational expectations, by the expectations of the organizational management than by the scientific community, would be my hypothesis and the conclusion from my research. Then we have a trend towards institutionalization and professionalization of media relations, which has a number of positive impacts, such as that the motivation for media contacts increases, that the competence of researchers, many have do media trainings nowadays, and also the resources for media communications increase, and that may help to solve the resource problem of science journalism. You know, the resources for science journalism are decreasing in the United States and also in other countries. However, this increasing institutionalization and professionalization goes along with strategic utilization of these media contexts. And that, I think, means that researchers and public relations departments worry now more about the effects of their media visibility than about the truth of the messages conveyed to the general public. And this, in the long run, may create a credibility risk for science itself and for the researchers. And it may also have unintended consequences for the public concept of science. For example, if you want to be in the media, you have to anticipate the expectations of the media, and the expectations of the media are what you do as a researcher has to be in one way or another relevant to society. And a very easy way to construct that relevance is pointing to possible applications of the research. So this may lead to some kind of overemphasizing the practical applications and the proximity to application of the research. Another thing is that because of the organizational interest of being seen as the originator of the achievement, is that in press releases, for example, organizations may point to those aspects of the research that they provide. That is, they're perhaps talking more easily about the experiments, about the labs, about new projects, about money, rather than about the cognitive aspect, the thoughts, the innovative ideas, and the new knowledge that is produced by creative individuals in the context, in the intellectual context of scientific communities. Well, the title of my talk ends with the name Succeed. So the last slide I would like to spend on the question of success. It may surprise some of you, but mostly scientists are quite positive, or at least mixed about their interactions. Only few are clearly seeing these interactions as mostly dissatisfied. Are mostly dissatisfied about the interactions. And I mean, this nevertheless means that there is a considerable number of researchers who are dissatisfied with their own interactions, and they also see media coverage in general less positive than their own interactions, the outcome of their own interactions. So both surveys, or all surveys more or less, I could show many graphs of this kind showing a rather high proportion of scientists satisfied with their interactions. And the question is, why is that the case? And maybe there's also some evidence that it's increasing over time. And my hypothesis is that this high satisfaction is partly due to a change in the criteria of satisfaction in congruence with the strategic turn of science communication. That means scientists nowadays are satisfied because they perceive a benefit for themselves, for the research, for the visibility, for getting funding by the media interactions, and do not worry as much as before about the accuracy and whether the message went across undisturbed. Thank you.